In this game, Magnus Carlsen shows us a way of thinking that can help anybody make better plans in the game of chess. Now, I don't know how he would have articulated it. Perhaps what he does is completely at a subconscious level. But for us, we can look at it at a conscious level and maybe try to implement it into our own games. And the idea I'm talking about are fantasy positions. That is the idea that instead of calculating, what you do is say, on what squares do my pieces belong? And then you move your pieces to those squares. In fact, older editions of Jeremy Silman's How to Reassess Your Chess talked about fantasy positions. He got rid of it in the most recent edition, which I thought was a mistake. I think they're very valuable. So let's watch this game played between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in Midiash in 2011 and see how Magnus approaches the game of chess a little bit here. He begins with d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, and here Nakamura plays bishop to e7. The idea, of course, is to avoid the pin that comes after knight to f6. So Magnus goes ahead and takes on d5, plays an exchange variation, and plays the bishop to f4. And c6 is played, and we have a Carlsbad structure. We see this strong point on d5 for black, limiting the knight at c3, but white has a lot of potential in this structure also. Magnus plays queen to c2, played against this light-squared bishop, keeps it from coming to f5, which is a nice diagonal for that bishop. So what Hikaru does is he plays bishop to g4. The idea, he wants to reroute that bishop to g6 and still challenge on this light square diagonal. It's just going to be a little slower process. e3, bishop to h5, bishop to d3, and bishop to g6. So he's able to exchange off white's light squared bishop, which is a good piece. Magnus goes ahead and takes on g6, hg6. This does open the h-file for black, so white does have to be careful if he decides to castle short, but it does create a pawn weakness that Carlsen can work on. And he, in fact, castles long. Somewhat unusual in a Carlsbad structure, but not unheard of. And it creates a sharp position. And one of the reasons you don't see it very often is because of the move Nakamura plays here after knight f6, f3 to keep the knight out. Knight b to d7, knight g to e2, b5. That's the move I was talking about. Black can attack fairly quickly on the queen side, but Carlsen knew that, of course, and the best way to deal with an attack on the side of the board, counterattack in the center, and Carlsen does that with e4 here. Nakamura just continues on, kicks the knight away from the center. The knight goes to a4. The knight's on the side of the board, but it does a good job of blockading and slowing down any attack black would have on the queen's side. Nakamura takes on e4, pawn takes e4, and queen to a5. So Hikaru is not yet committed to castling, but at some point he probably is going to need to castle short, and we'll have a position with an attack on both sides of the board. Black, of course, wants to play c5 at some point, maybe rook c8, c5. Magnus moves his king to b1, a standard idea when you castle long, and Nakamura castles. So Carlsen wastes no time. He immediately plays h4. He wants to open up the h-file for his pieces, use this g6 pawn as a hook that he can exchange pawns and open up lines against the king. Nakamura plays rook f to e8, not only putting some pressure on the e4 pawn, but the f8 square could be used for a bishop or a knight as a defensive piece. Now here, Magnus plays e5, kicking the knight away. Now, if Nakamura plays knight to h5, then just g4. After knight f4, white's attack is very quick, and he would probably just be better there, breaking on the king's side. But knight to d5 is played, centralizing that knight. And now h5 comes. Obviously, he does not want to take on h5 because then white would just double rooks on the h-file. So g5 hits that bishop, and Carlsen ignores that. And he goes ahead and plays h6. The reason being that if Nakamura were to take on f4, then after pawn takes pawn, the queen and rook meet at h7, and black is just in huge trouble here. So Nakamura instead plays g6. The bishop which is attacked, goes back to c1. Now knight 7 to b6. Nakamura wants to challenge this knight at a4 because it's blockading so effectively. So Carlsen just goes ahead and plays it to c5. Bishop takes, pawn takes. And here Nakamura plays a very interesting move, a good move. He plays the move b3. If he plays more passively with knight to d7, attacking c5, and after e6, knight to d4, this rook is going to run out of squares after rook f6, bishop g5, and it can no longer defend the c6 pawn. So Nakamura plays the move b3. Now, if Carlsen takes with the pawn, then knight to b4 threatens the queen and threatens mate. And while Nakamura he can save the queen here if he wants. We won't show that line, but because he avoids it, it's still really great. Carlsen can save the queen. It's still great for black. So Carlsen instead plays queen takes b3, queen takes c5. So this is a moment where I want to talk about the possibility of a fantasy position. And it's clear what Carlsen wants to do as the game unfolds. He would love to have this knight on e2, here on g5, where it's defended by the bishop and causes all kinds of trouble. And he wants the rook on f1 pressing down as hard as possible on this f7 pawn, which the queen also can assist in. It's blocked by the knight at the moment. And he knows if he gets a knight at g5, rook d to f1, combined with this pawn, it's going to be almost impossible to defend his attack. So he now knows where he wants his pieces. Now all he has to do is find a way to get them there. And so let's watch how he does that. First, he plays the knight to d4. Then there are some threats. He could play e6 and loosen up this whole light squared structure here. But he's giving up a pawn on e5, and he does that so he can get his pieces where he wants them. Rook takes e5, and now knight to f3. Hits the rook, and also is threatening to come into g5, and there isn't really much black can do about it. He plays the rook to e2. The move rook to e7 might be a little better because of the pressure that's going to be generated on the f7 pawn. But rook to e2 is definitely the more aggressive move. Nakamura usually plays the more aggressive move. And the first piece has arrived at its destination. The knight has gone from e2 to d4 to f3 to g5. But he knew many moves ago he wanted that knight there. So he systematically found a way to get it on the square he wanted. Queen comes back to e7, doubling on the e file and adding a defender to f7. Queen to d3. This is also a good square for the queen where it puts some potential pressure on this g6 pawn. If this pawn is ever to get undermined, this is another part of the fantasy position construction that Carlsen wants. The queen on d3, pressing on g6. Now, rook to f8. That means that Nakamura also knows what white wants to do. He knows that Carlsen wants to play rook d to f1 and press on f7. Obviously, players at this level are going to know those kinds of things. So he preemptively defends f7, but it doesn't really matter. Carlsen goes ahead, puts that last piece on that square he wants, and now he has the formation he was after. And it looks like it's well defended by black, but it isn't. He's in huge, huge trouble here. And the threat at the moment is knight takes f7. And if rook takes, queen takes g6 check. And after king to f8 to defend, keep the rook defended, then just h7. And he's going to either queen or lose everything. So because of that, black plays f5. Defending in this way, but that loosens everything up. And remember, Carlsen, part of his structure that he wanted was to put pressure on g6. So now he enhances that pressure with g4. So that if the pawn were to take on g4, the queen could take on g6. Knight to a4 from Nakamura, trying to generate some pressure of his own. Maybe play queen to b4, come in on b2. But now queen to d4. And the threat is h7 check, which would cost black his queen and everything. So Nakamura blocks with this queen, and it turns out because Carlsen's pieces are on such great squares, he can trade queens off and he's still fine. Same amount of pressure, basically. So queen takes e5, rook takes e5, but the pressure remains. Carlsen takes on f5, and here Nakamura takes with the pawn. And taking with the rook seems more natural. The problem is after rook takes, say rook takes h7 check, king h8, rook to e1, and the threats are pretty serious here. The rook is penetrating down the file, and black is lost there. So he takes with the pawn, but now the knight goes back to f3 with basically a double attack. The first is obviously just threatening to take the rook, but now he's opened up the g file, so he's also threatening to check on the g file and get in. The rook comes back to e7, rook f to g1 check, king to h7, and now rook to g7 check. If rook takes g7, then pawn takes, king takes, bishop h6 check wins material, wins the exchange. So king to h8 is played, rook h to g1, just doubling up, rook f to e8, and now knight to h4, with the obvious threat of knight to g6 checkmate, right? So in this position, Nakamura played rook takes g7, but there wasn't a lot of time on his clock. I don't know how much exactly, but he actually resigned. So he made the move, but then resigned after making his own move. And the reason is simple: after rook takes, the knight is coming into g6, and black could give up his rook, but this is a completely lost endgame. So a very interesting game from Magnus Carlsen, and we see that there wasn't a lot of long, complex calculation. He knew the squares his pieces belonged on, and he systematically moved them there. Had a fantasy position, and he got his pieces to those squares, and an elite player lost as a result of that. So a good strategy for us when we're trying to plan in chess: which squares do our pieces belong on? Put them there. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.